When most people think of the civil rights movement, they think of all the people that stood up and used their voices and their public actions to fight for their freedom. They are not aware that there was much more going on in the fight for racial integration. The African American citizens of the United States were not just being discriminated against in public spaces, but also economically and in some cases violently. Police brutality was the #1 problem blacks faced in the period leading up to the Detroit race riot. But that was not the only cause. There was insufficient housing in almost all neighborhoods, and sometimes the whites went so far as to build walls separating them from the blacks, such as the one on 8 Mile Road. Neighborhoods that were predominantly black were bulldozed over to make way for new freeways and highways. So let's ask ourselves, if we were experiencing such horrible racial injustice, would we just stand by and watch as our neighborhoods were destroyed, jobs given away, and our own people beaten down on the streets simply for the color of our skin? Voices can only travel so far and say so much, so when there is nothing left to be said, those who advocate for nonviolence can't stand in the way of those who are taking violent means. On Sunday, July 23, 1967, in Detroit, Michigan, police raided an unlicensed after-hours bar on 12th Street, a predominantly black neighborhood. The police were expecting only a few people, but instead found 82 black civilians celebrating the return home of friends from the Vietnam War. They attempted to arrest everyone in the building and caused quite a scene. A large crowd gathered in protest to the arrest, and after the last arrest vehicle pulled away, full-scale rioting began. Throughout the day, the rioting grew worse and worse, with people looting buildings and setting them on fire. The sheriff alerted the police and the National Guard was called in, but because it was a Sunday afternoon, it took hours for enough troops to show up to even begin to stop the rioting. The riots were described as having a carnival atmosphere. Police watched looting but barely arrested anyone because of inadequate numbers. Despite attempts to prevent copycat riots throughout the city, the riot soon spread throughout Detroit. Violence escalated, resulting in 483 fires, 231 incidents reported per hour, and 1,800 arrests in the first day. The riot lasted in Detroit for 5 days and evolved into one of the deadliest and most destructive riots in U.S. history, surpassing the violence and property destruction of Detroit's 1943 race riots. Over 10,000 people participated in the riots, and over 100,000 gathered to watch. When the rioting was over, 43 people had died, 1,189 people had been injured, 7,000 people arrested, and 2,509 stores had been burned or looted. The riots had a major effect on the civil rights movement, especially for the black citizens of Detroit. There was more recognition for the blacks and more equality economically. More housing was offered and positions of authority were given to some black citizens, giving them more of a voice in society. It is arguable whether or not black militancy was necessary during the civil rights movement, but it is definitely a circumstance that begs the question, what if it hadn't happened? Of course, those 7,000 people wouldn't have been arrested, those 43 people wouldn't have died, and those 1,189 people wouldn't have been injured. Maybe. But the white leaders would not have gotten the point. The civil rights movement was a war, and no war can be fought without casualties.